What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. How did doctors operate before anesthesia? Besides alcohol and opium, speed was a key part of the strategy. In 1811, the English novelist Frances Burney was living in France when she received a distressing diagnosis. At 59 years old, Burney had breast cancer. The disease would certainly be fatal unless her French doctors proposed Burney was willing to undergo a mastectomy. Surgical anesthesia had not yet been invented and wouldn't be for nearly another 50 years. The harrowing prospect of being cut open while fully conscious and fully sensitive to pain filled Burney with a sickening dread. Yet, like countless other desperate individuals before her, she was willing to experience unimaginable agony in order to preserve her life. On the day of her surgery, Burney would have been blindfolded and held down by 4 or more dressers, whose chief job was to physically restrain the patient while the surgeon did his gruesome work as quickly as possible. For Burney, every second was nothing short of torture. Burney wrote to her sister that I had no instructions not to restrain my cries when the terrible steel was inserted into the breast, cutting through veins, arteries, and nerves. I began a scream that lasted unremittingly during the whole time of the incision, and I almost marvel that it rings not in my ears still. So excruciating was the agony. The shock of the pain was so intense that Burney lost consciousness twice, but incredibly, the operation was a success. She healed and lived another 29 years. Burney was among the lucky few who survived a major surgical procedure in an era before anesthesia or an understanding of germ theory. There's always a debate about what were the most important moments in human history, but certainly pain relief in the mid-19th century was one of the greatest, says Ira Rutkow, a retired surgeon and medical historian. That was followed 40 years later by the discovery of bacteria and viruses. 4 centuries before those scientific landmarks, surgery was an excruciating ordeal reserved for life-threatening cases. The only things that doctors could treat were severely broken bones, decayed teeth, and tumors close to the surface. They would not attempt internal surgery. The concept of operating on something inside the brain or the chest, that was unthinkable, says Rutkow, author of Empire of the Scalpel: A History of Surgery. They didn't know the anatomy. They didn't know how to stop bleeding. They didn't have pain relief. They certainly didn't know anything about infections. So those areas of the body were off limits. Opium, alcohol, and other ancient remedies. Medical historians recognize October 16, 1846 as a turning point in surgical history, when 2 American doctors painlessly removed a lump from a patient's jaw using ether, the world's first effective anesthetic. For thousands of years before that, doctors and healers around the world experimented with herbs, plants, and even prayers that would relieve at least some of the agonizing pain of surgery. As early as 400 BC, the Sumerians harnessed the analgesic effects of the opium poppy, the active ingredient in morphine. The legendary Chinese physician Hua Tuo, who lived at the turn of the 3rd century AD, gave his surgical patients an herbal cocktail called mefizin, which may have included cannabis, wine, and wolfsbane, which contains a powerful and potentially deadly neurotoxin. Nearly 1,000 years before ether and chloroform were first inhaled as surgical anesthetics, the Persian physician Ibn Sina AD 9801037 recorded a similar pain relief technique called the soporific sponge. A bundle of rags was soaked in a potent herbal concoction. Recipes contained mandrake, henbane, opium, and wine, and held under the nose of the patient, inducing what later Islamic physicians called the Great Rest. In ancient Peru, a type of cranial surgery called trepanation was surprisingly common. Used to treat head injuries and even headaches, trepanning involved making an incision in a patient's scalp and drilling a small hole in the skull to relieve pressure. John Verano, an anthropologist who has studied hundreds of trepanned Peruvian skulls, thinks that Incan and earlier cultures may have used a corn beer called chicha to relax the patient and possibly the surgeon, but dismisses the idea that coca leaves provided significant pain relief. Coca leaves may have been chewed during the operation. People say it calms you down, says Verano, author of Holes in the Head, The Art and Archaeology of Trepanation in Ancient Peru. But coca is a mild stimulant. By no means is it an anesthetic. Doesn't put you out. Without anesthesia, speed was everything. For surgeons operating without anesthesia, time was the enemy. The longer a patient was on the table, the greater their suffering and the greater the chance that they would die from blood loss or shock. Amputations were the true test of any surgeon worth his salt in the early 19th century. The quicker the surgery, the better the odds that the patient would survive. By the 19th century, doctors knew anatomy and they knew how to stop the bleeding, but they couldn't stop the pain, so they would try to perform an amputation of an arm or a leg in 25 seconds, says Rutkow. In less than 30 seconds, that leg was gone. In the 1840s, the famed British surgeon Robert Liston would storm into his London operating theatre and cry out, "Time me, gentlemen, time me." In just 25 seconds, he could use a straight knife to cut open a patient's leg and see straight through the bone. To save time, he reportedly held the bloody knife in his teeth. 5 out of 6 of Liston's amputees survived, an impressive success rate for the time, but Liston's incredible speed could come at a cost. During one historically botched procedure, Liston accidentally cut off the fingers of one of the dressers holding the patient down. According to the BBC, both the patient and the dresser died from infections and a third observer died of shock. Hypnotism becomes a surgical fad. Just a few years before ether and chloroform revolutionized medicine, one of the most buzzed about methods for achieving painless surgery was hypnosis, originally known as mesmerism. Franz Anton Mesmer (1734–1815) was an Austrian physician who developed a theory that all illness and disease could be cured by manipulating a universal fluid within the body. Mesmer began by working with magnets, but then turned to animal magnetism, his term for a type of hypnosis that put patients into a deep sleep. Mesmerism as a medical practice was widely discredited in the 18th century, but it experienced a popular revival in 1840s England as a form of anesthesia. British physician John Eliot's son promoted mesmerism in the pages of The Lancet, and performed surgery on mesmerized patients in front of London audiences that included Charles Dickens and Michael Faraday. Inspired by Eliot's son, surgeon James S. Dale opened the Calcutta Mesmeric Hospital in India, where he used hypnosis to sedate patients undergoing amputations, cataract surgeries and the removal of scrotal tumors. Mesmerism had vocal critics in the medical establishment, including Robert Liston, the speedy surgeon. When Liston first got his hands on ether in December 1846, he used it to sedate a patient undergoing a leg amputation. When the patient woke up after the operation, he asked Liston, "When are you going to begin?" Floored by the power of ether, a revolutionary new anesthetic from America, Liston proclaimed, "This Yankee Dodge, gentlemen, beats mesmerism hollow." How did doctors operate before anesthesia? In the centuries before surgical anesthesia, the act of surgery was nothing short of a torturous endeavor, a gruesome and often fatal gamble that blended pain, speed, and desperation in a dance as old as recorded medicine itself. To be operated on before the mid-19th century was to subject oneself to a world of horror. The absence of effective pain relief meant that operations, especially major ones, were typically a last resort, reserved for only the most dire and life-threatening conditions. Unlike today's sterile operating rooms with softly beeping monitors and a team of professionals ensuring patient comfort, surgery in the era before anesthesia was a public, messy, and excruciating affair. Patients were often blindfolded, tied down or held down by strong attendants known as dressers, and surrounded by onlookers, including medical students and curious observers. One of the most notorious cases illuminating this era is that of the English novelist Frances Burney, who in 1811 underwent a mastectomy without any anesthesia. Her harrowing written account details the sheer agony and emotional trauma of being fully conscious and fully sensitive to every slice of the surgeon's knife. Blindfolded and pinned, her only recourse was to scream, and scream she did, uninterruptedly, through the entire ordeal. And yet, incredibly, she survived and went on to live another 29 years. Such survival tales were uncommon. The success of these operations often hinged on the skill and speed of the surgeon, the cleanliness of the tools, which in most cases were not sterilized at all, and sheer luck. At the time, medical understanding of human anatomy had advanced significantly, but knowledge of infection, germ theory, and antiseptic technique was still decades away. Consequently, the tools of the trade were crude and the consequences of surgery often deadly due to sepsis or hemorrhage. Surgeons prided themselves on speed because speed was the only way to save a patient from excessive blood loss and psychological shock. By the early 19th century, the top surgeons were capable of amputating a limb in under 30 seconds. Robert Liston, a legendary British surgeon of the era, was famous for bellowing, "Time me, gentlemen," before plunging into the flesh of his unfortunate patients. His quickest documented amputation took a mere 25 seconds. He reportedly held his blood-covered knives in his teeth to free his hands. Though 5 out of 6 of his patients survived, his lightning speed could sometimes backfire. In one infamous operation, he accidentally severed the fingers of an assistant and slashed the coat of a spectator, who died of shock. The only operation in history with a 300% mortality rate resulted in the deaths of all 3 patients. Pain management in those days came in many forms, though none truly reliable. Alcohol was the most common anesthetic, with patients downing pints of gin or whiskey before surgery in the hope of dulling the pain. Opium and laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, were sometimes used to reduce sensitivity to pain, though dosing was tricky and inconsistent. In ancient civilizations, natural remedies were employed as proto-anesthetics. The Sumerians, for instance, knew of the opium poppy's power as early as 400 BC. And Chinese healer Hua Tuo concocted potions believed to contain cannabis and wine to sedate patients. The soporific sponge of medieval Islamic medicine, soaked in a cocktail of mandrake, henbane, opium and wine, was another early attempt at rendering patients unconscious or semi-conscious during surgery. The vast majority of patients, despite these efforts, were awake and screaming throughout their procedures. In South America, particularly ancient Peru, cranial surgery called trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole in the skull to treat head trauma, was surprisingly common. Anthropological evidence suggests these operations were performed with a good deal of precision, and some patients even survived multiple trepanations. Though coca leaves were chewed to relieve discomfort and increase endurance, experts agree that they were far from effective anesthetics. The survival rate may have had more to do with the skill of the surgeon and a lack of postoperative infection than with any pain relief. As the Enlightenment brought about more scientific approaches to medicine, attempts at pain mitigation became more experimental. Hypnosis, then called mesmerism after its founder Franz Mesmer, gained traction in the early 19th century. Some doctors started using mesmerism to put patients into trance-like states prior to surgery, despite the widespread rejection of his theories about animal magnetism. James S. Dale, working in India, performed amputations and tumor removals using mesmerism and reported encouraging success. However, skeptics in the medical community dismissed the practice as quackery, and it faded from legitimacy with the advent of chemical anesthesia. October 16, 1846, marked a watershed moment in medical history. On that day, American dentist William T.G. Morton demonstrated the use of ether as an anesthetic during the removal of a neck tumor at Massachusetts General Hospital. The patient, Edward Gilbert Abbott, felt no pain. The surgical community was stunned. The word quickly spread, and hospitals and surgeons across Europe and beyond began using it within a few months. Chloroform followed ether and was promoted by people like James Young Simpson in Scotland. Although chloroform had its own risks, including sudden cardiac arrest, it was a popular alternative due to its less pungent odor and ease of use. Nevertheless, the arrival of anesthesia marked a transformative period in medicine. Surgeons could now work slowly, carefully, and on previously unthinkable areas of the body, including the abdomen and brain. The field of surgery saw rapid growth. The advent of anesthesia did not immediately eliminate all problems. There was still a complete lack of understanding about infection. Tools and hands were rarely washed, and hospitals were filthy. It wasn't until Joseph Lister promoted antiseptic methods in the 1860s, inspired by Louis Pasteur's work on germ theory, that mortality rates dropped significantly. Combined, anesthesia and antiseptics revolutionized surgery and redefined the limits of medical science. Before anesthesia, surgery was more of a gamble than a guarantee. Each operation tested the limits of human endurance, often ending in trauma or death. The patients were warriors of circumstance, and the surgeons, artists of controlled brutality. The history of surgery before anesthesia is a testament to human resilience and an unrelenting desire to heal, even at the cost of unbearable pain. That we now enter operating rooms with relative confidence and minimal fear is a modern miracle, paid for with centuries of screaming mouths and blood-soaked aprons. How did doctors operate before anesthesia? The cruel and bloody story of surgical procedures without pain relief for most of human history. Surgery was synonymous with agony. Patients undergoing even the most basic procedures faced excruciating pain, widespread infections, and the constant risk of death prior to the mid-19th century introduction of modern anesthesia. In order to carry out procedures that would now be considered routine, surgeons relied on crude methods like alcohol, opium, hypnosis, and, most importantly, speed. They lacked both antiseptic and pain management tools. The story of pre-anesthetic surgery is one of desperation, ingenuity, and unimaginable suffering. 1. Surgery before anesthesia. A nightmare of pain. In 1811, English novelist Frances Burney underwent a mastectomy in Paris to treat breast cancer. Her harrowing account of the experience offers a glimpse into the horrors of pre-anesthetic surgery. When the dreadful steel was plunged into the breast, cutting through veins, arteries, flesh, nerves, I needed no injunctions not to restrain my cries. I began a scream that lasted unremittingly during the whole time of the incision, and I almost marvel that it rings not in my ears still. So excruciating was the agony. Burney was blindfolded and held down by 4 assistants while the surgeon worked as quickly as possible. She fainted twice from the pain but miraculously survived, living another 29 years. Her ordeal was not unusual. Before anesthesia, surgery was a last resort, reserved only for life-threatening conditions. Why didn't more surgery happen? No pain relief. Patients endured full awareness of every cut. High infection risk. Germ theory was unknown. Sepsis was common. No internal surgery. Surgeons operated only on visible body parts, limbs, surface tumors, wounds. Massive blood loss. Tourniquets and cauterization were crude and often ineffective. Ira Rutkow, a medical historian, explains, the concept of operating on something inside the brain or the chest was unthinkable. They didn't know the anatomy, how to stop bleeding, or anything about infections. 2. Ancient pain relief. Opium, alcohol, and the soporific sponge. Before modern anesthesia, doctors experimented with various substances to dull pain. Opium, from 400 BC to the present, used by Sumerians, Egyptians, and Greeks for pain relief. Morphine, derived from opium, was isolated in 1804 but not widely used in surgery. Herbal blends. Hua, China, 3rd century AD, used mefizin, a blend of cannabis, wine, and wolfsbane, a toxic plant. Ibn Sina, Persia, 10th century, developed the soporific sponge, a rag soaked in opium, mandrake, and wine, held under the patient's nose. Alcohol, universal but ineffective. Whiskey, wine, and beer were common, but they did little to block pain. Problem: drunk patients often vomited or thrashed during operations. Coca leaves, 500 to 1500 AD, during the Inca Empire. In ancient Peru, drilling holes in the skull, known as trepanation, was surprisingly common. Coca leaves, source of cocaine, were chewed, but they were stimulants, not anesthetics. 3. The era of speed. Time me, gentlemen. Without anesthesia, speed was the surgeon's greatest tool. A fast operation meant heavy checkmark, less pain. Heavy checkmark, lower risk of shock. Heavy checkmark, better survival rates. Robert Liston, the fastest surgeon in London, 1794 to 1847, famous for amputating a leg in 25 seconds, held the scalpel in his teeth to save time. Success rate: 5 out of 6 patients survived, remarkable for the era. But speed had risks. In one infamous case, Liston accidentally amputated his assistant's fingers. The patient, assistant, and a spectator all died from infection and shock. 4. Bizarre alternatives. Hypnosis and mesmerism. Before ether, some surgeons tried hypnosis, also known as mesmerism, as an anesthetic. Franz Anton Mesmer, 1734–1815. Animal magnetism was said to be the cause of illness. Used hypnosis to induce trances. 1808–1859. James S. Dale headed the Indian Mesmeric Hospital in Calcutta. Performed 300+ painless surgeries, amputations, tumor removals, using hypnosis. But mesmerism was controversial. Critics dismissed it as quackery. Robert Liston mocked it, until he saw ether in action in 1846. 5. The Turning Point. Ether and the Birth of Modern Anesthesia, 1846. On October 16, 1846, at Massachusetts General Hospital, dentist William T.G. Morton demonstrated ether anesthesia during a jaw tumor removal. The patient was not in any pain. Robert Liston, initially skeptical, tried ether and declared, "This Yankee Dodge beats mesmerism hollow." Within months, chloroform 1847 was introduced, revolutionizing surgery. Why was anesthesia so revolutionary? Heavy checkmark pain-free operations. Heavy checkmark longer, more complex surgeries, e.g. abdominal, brain. Lower rates of mortality. 6. Conclusion. From torture to triumph. Before anesthesia, surgery was a brutal, terrifying ordeal. Patients faced agony, infection, and death, while surgeons relied on speed, alcohol, and crude painkillers. The discovery of ether and chloroform in the 1840s transformed medicine, paving the way for modern surgery. Final thought. Francis Burney mastectomy without anesthesia reminds us how far medicine has come, and why pain relief remains one of humanity's greatest achievements. Would you like more details on famous pre-anesthesia surgeries, Napoleon surgeons, Civil War amputations, the dark side of early anesthesia, chloroform deaths, addiction risks, how anesthesia works, science behind ether, modern anesthetics?